A few years ago, I became obsessed with a problem, and that is there's no simple way of thinking about climate change solutions and greenhouse gas emission reduction. The problem is so large, and it touches every aspect of the economy. You hear about clean energy, you hear about electrification, you hear about clean hydrogen, carbon capture, but there's nothing that puts these things together. So where do these emissions come from? Fortunately, about 75% of them come from burning fossil fuels. And the remaining 25% come from the combination of agriculture, industrial processes, waste management, and other activities. You can break these down further, the fossil fuel combination, into 4 drivers. And those are the transportation sector, that's burning oil in your cars. The power sector, which is predominantly burning natural gas and coal to generate electricity. Industrial processes, which is about generating heat, for example, to make steel. And then residential buildings, which is primarily heating the building and cooking. So if you don't take anything away from the majority of my presentation, I'd like you to retain this sentence. It's a simple sentence, and that is, clean electricity is the foundation of all climate change solutions. And the consequence of this means that we need to install more electricity in the United States than the entire existing electrical grid that's been built over 100 years, and very quickly.
That is the voice of Richard Keiser, speaking recently to an audience of business leaders on the urgency of accelerating the energy transition away from fossil fuels. Welcome to the American Resilience Podcast. I'm Roger Sorkin, the director of the American Resilience Project, where we make films designed to influence public policy, inspire cultural change, and strengthen civilizational security. Richard Keiser is the founder and CEO of Common Energy, one of the country's largest community solar providers, which manages over 400 megawatts of clean energy capacity, serving some of the largest energy users in the country. Richard is the recipient of the Sanford C. Bernstein Royal Reach Award for outstanding contributions to research. He's a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he's the publisher of numerous analyses of energy markets and clean energy technology in the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Bloomberg, Forbes, and in energy publications around the world. I caught up with Richard Keiser after his presentation at the Thomson Reuters Responsible Business Conference in New York, and his talk was entitled How to Solve Climate Change in 20 Minutes, which was the length of his presentation, obviously not something that we can actually do in 20 minutes, considering the enormity of the challenge. And I asked him to spell out how he came to this conclusion and how these solutions can be implemented.
The broad-based solution to U.S. emissions is related to electrification. And when you start adding up the different sectors that need to be electrified, for example, transportation and moving to EVs and electrified long-distance haul trucking and increased rail and public transportation, when you add up the amount of kilowatt hours needed for that, you get to a very large number, around 900 billion kilowatt hours. And if you progress through this logical sequence, going through each sector of the economy where you need to do that, for example, electrifying heating and cooling and buildings, that's another trillion kilowatt hours. Electrifying the industrial sector, depending on how you want to count it, could be another 500 billion kilowatt hours. And then finally replacing the existing generation, you get to a much, much larger electrical grid. In fact, the new generation, which can be easily calculated to run the economy this way, significantly exceeds the entire installed base of U.S. electricity infrastructure. And so that's an important realization, and that is an important policy guide, not just at the national level, but also at the state and infrastructure level.
So there were a lot of numbers in your talk, and admittedly, it is hard for the average person to get their mind around how much we're actually emitting. And I found it really understandable when, in addition to giving us those numbers, you actually put it in terms of a rate. So, for our podcast audience here, can you just summarize how much carbon we're actually emitting in those terms?
Sure. Even people with a high degree of numeracy have struggle once you start getting past, a million and a billion. And if you think about U.S. electricity consumption, it's 4 petawatt hours, which is 4 times 10 to the 15th power, so 15 zeros. If you look at U.S. emissions alone, it's around 6.6 gigatons, which is 6.6 billion metric tons, and so that's equivalent to about 14.5 trillion pounds. And people start getting lost in these kind of numbers, and so I find it easier to understand as a rate. So if you divide that latter number by the number of seconds in a year, you get to approximately a little bit less than half a million pounds of carbon emissions per second.
In the U.S.?
In the U.S. alone, okay, roughly 5 to 6 times that for global emissions. Okay, and so that's one way to try to make those numbers a little bit more accessible.
So the name of your talk was How to Solve Climate Change in 20 Minutes, which is a great title, but obviously one that only represents the length of time it takes you to explain the solution. And when we look across the country and we see 50 different states, all with their own regulatory agencies or public utility or public service commissions, how can we get all of them onto the same page and move them really as quickly as we can towards mass electrification? And what can be done at the federal level as well to move this along?
Yeah. Let me give you a historical framework for responding to that. The whole genesis of the United States was built under a framework of fear of centralized government. Okay, the earliest settlers of the United States were escaping monarchy, and therefore there was a great emphasis on decentralized control and decentralized decision making, which is the reason why we have strong state law in this country relative to federal law. This turns out to be an important feature in deterring certain negative behaviors, but it can also be extremely frustrating when speed is required. And so the United States is disadvantaged in this regard with respect to implementation. The most important takeaway from my discussion was showing numerically that clean electricity is the foundation for all other climate solutions. Okay? And if you have that simple statement as a realization, then a number of logical consequences follow from that. The first is the use of federal land for renewable energy installation and possibly for additional nuclear. Right now, somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 million acres have been leased to oil and gas, and less than 500,000 approximately have been leased for solar. Okay, so here you're looking at a 25x difference. And that doesn't necessarily imply that the leases for oil and gas would need to be terminated, because with oil and gas leases, the quote-unquote action is under the ground, and the surface footprint is actually relatively small. Versus with solar, for example, would be the opposite. There's almost nothing going on under the ground except for your home run lines and transmission, and it's all on the surface. And so those co-locate actually reasonably well. So that would be the first thing, is a major initiative which could be done through an auction process to have large bids for, let's say, 2 terawatts worth of additional power. Okay. The second thing relates to the private sector and the permitting process for getting larger, both small and large, but larger renewable energy projects permitted, which is cumbersome, time-consuming, and expensive. The third is the interconnection process. And the interconnection process is largely controlled by the incumbent utility, and they have tremendous leeway in both the speed and the cost that they charge to potential IPPs, independent power producers, in their connection, and they can make a project uneconomic or economic depending on where that price is set. Okay, and so having some framework for both streamlining, reducing, prioritizing access to the grid would be an important change. And then the fourth thing is, which is starting to happen, fortunately, with this administration, is a much greater investment in high voltage direct current lines, which could be used to transport power and make the grid more interconnected. And that would relieve some of the curtailment issues that we see with one part of the grid running essentially energy into the ground because it's not well connected to a neighboring grid to use that energy.
So what kind of opposition have you encountered to your analysis, and how do we overcome that opposition?
Well, first, they're not just my ideas. Many people have contributed to the current understanding of this framework based around electrification. I published about 2 years ago a framework basically reverse engineering an important document that the U.S. publishes each year, which is the annual inventory of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions and sinks. I believe that's the first time that had ever been done before. Shortly thereafter, there were studies published by Princeton, Berkeley, the DOE, and NREL that largely confirmed the numbers that I published. So there's a broad body of agreement around what is needed to decarbonize and electrify U.S. society and the U.S. economy. You know, there is opposition from traditional places you would expect. Obviously, if utilities own generation and then someone wants to own generation and take those kilowatt hours away from them, then you're on a direct conflict of interest in many cases, not in all, but in many cases. And very frustratingly, there is plenty of opposition from other, what I would call, poorly informed environmental groups that look at land use for solar and wind as something to oppose without having any framework for really quantifying the vast environmental destruction taking place through our presently hydrocarbon-based society. So that is particularly frustrating if you do understand numbers and math and the scope of the problem. So there are many obstacles from many different parts of the economy.
So we can certainly acknowledge that the oil, gas, and what remains of the coal industry have the most to lose when it comes to electrifying the economy. And it's pretty clear that they work to sow doubt on climate change, and they question the efficacy of climate change solutions, and they've been doing this for decades. But which environmental groups would you say have their priorities straight when it comes to clean electricity as our top priority?
Thank you for the question. There are two. First, it's important to delineate. Right now, there is a massive funding effort from oil and gas friendly organizations to found and support environmental sounding named groups that are not environmental focused. Okay, so that is this problem has been studied extensively by Brown University. They've done some outstanding work showing this funding train, and that so it's important to know that if you're in XYZ town in Massachusetts and a new group shows up that's calling themselves Protect Massachusetts Land, they may be actually oil and gas interests that are focused on deterring these types of projects, because even though we burn almost zero oil in this country for electricity, if there is abundant clean electricity, then that will dramatically alter the equation for EV ownership, which then, so the derivative they're very concerned about. And it's so for the truly well-meaning organizations, it's a long conversation. It really depends on the leadership and the sophistication of the leadership. You have outstanding groups like the Sierra Club and Greenpeace and other folks, Nature Conservancy, that are very well informed about these types of issues. And then you have some smaller groups that are frankly small resources and, in my humble opinion, small-minded and not able to grasp really the full consequences of where their position is.
So even though we're dealing with a very decentralized energy generation and regulatory system in this country, where do you think the most effective leadership can come from to help us succeed in getting the amount of clean electricity capacity that we need?
If we were to electrify, quote unquote, everything tomorrow, then the U.S. electrical grid wouldn't be able to support it, and electricity prices across
the spectrum would increase very rapidly to curtail that demand. I mean, that would start happening beforehand. I personally believe that the way to lead on this is for the federal government to have a much greater initiative around the electricity infrastructure to get that to 7, possibly 8 petawatt hours as quickly as possible. And I think incentives would be very well spent directed toward that area, and then that would provide the underlying infrastructure through which these other industries could thrive.
So I want to talk for a moment about nuclear power. You mentioned this in your talk, and it's usually the biggest elephant in the room anytime a conversation about clean electricity comes up. Or, in this case, I would say emissions-free electricity, since we know that nuclear is not clean when it comes to nuclear waste. But you seem to have a fairly nuanced position on this, and I wonder if you can share your thoughts on what role, if any, nuclear has to play in all of this.
So let me begin by clarifying that I'm not inherently pro-nuclear. As someone who thinks about themselves as an analyst, I'm inherently interested in numbers. So the second aspect of responding to that is the temporal element. If you honestly believe that we are in a climate emergency, then this advocates for urgent action today with existing solutions. Okay? If you're in an emergency, if you're looking at your house and it is burning, then you got to get water on the house with a hose and buckets as quickly as possible. That is not the right time to contemplate the next innovation in insulation that will prevent the house from catching on fire in the first place. Okay? And so in that context, if you believe, and whether I believe that's the case or not, many scientists believe that to be the case, and it does appear to be supported by evidence in many factors. If you believe that's the case, then being opposed to safe nuclear is not a wise decision, because you're just perpetuating this crisis. You have to use the tools that you have. And one of the advantages of nuclear is its efficiency. You can run a nuclear reactor at, let's say, 90% capacity factor, okay? And those can be built in very large sizes. And in contrast, you have difficulty building solar, at least one installation at a time, greater than 1 gigawatt. And you have a capacity factor that might be between, 16 and 22%, okay? So you could have a reactor installation that is, let's say, 3 to 5 times the size of a solar installation. And then also you could have a production factor or efficiency factor, effectively another 5 times, combining to have 25 times the impact. And then you have stable base load, morning, night, rain, shine, okay? And so it's very difficult to take a solution like that off the table, especially when you have large, successful Western societies like France effectively running mostly on nuclear. Less so now because their fleet is very aged, but so I do believe that as a good interim solution, to solve a problem quickly.
So you mentioned the temporal aspect here, but what about the fact that nuclear just takes too long to build?
Yeah, that's not I just want to explain this perspective a little bit. That's not an inherent problem to nuclear. That is a permitting and kind of constructed attribute, let's say. It's not inherent. If a state of emergency were declared in the United States or another country, things can be done extremely quickly, as we've seen for warlike efforts. And I believe that that's an apt analogy to look at how U.S. society has been mobilized previously for wartime efforts in the context of this problem.
I'm glad you put it into those terms, because we are in a climate emergency. And you are a proponent of the federal government stepping in and treating this with the kind of urgency that wartime really would require. So can you expand on this concept of climate emergency, and how would you frame this narrative in ways that can help mobilize the federal government and mobilize business leaders to really recognize and really act like the house is in fact on fire?
Well, The most compelling case is to look at the economic impact, which is increasingly becoming real, right? So if you're in the insurance company and in the insurance business, you don't debate the effects of climate change because you're writing policies that are paying out, and now you're canceling policies and not offering policies along coastal areas. So like they're the first people to realize the direct economic impact. And so people tend to respond more directly to things that impact their wallet. And so rather than it being like a collective effort to give up meat, it should be really framed around the economic incentives and opportunities. And so rather than framing environmentalism in this transition as one of reductionism, reduce, reuse, recycle, it should be framed, in the words of a great scientist and environmentalist, it should be framed around the word flourishing. What can we do to transform society into one that flourishes, meaning economic prosperity, while also not damaging nature or mitigating as much as possible the damages to nature. So that's how I think about framing those.
And what would you say then to the general public and the average citizen? What's our role on this? How should we be looking at this?
I think that the framing of U.S. society, which is driven, and this mentality is driven largely by advertising around consumption and the need to acquire assets and relating that acquisition pursuit to happiness, that somewhere in this matter that link needs to be explored further. I don't believe that the message to society should be, look at all these things you need to give up to move in this direction. I think that things that are just completely wasted and not needed, like having the lights on when you're not in the room, or having your house cooled to 60 degrees, your summer house cooled to 60 degrees, even though you're 100 miles away, just because like these are completely wasted activities, and there's a lot of that goes on. And so I think you can save a tremendous amount of damage by not wasting and being more efficient with how we use things. That's the starting point for getting in a better situation. And then the second is more within the mentality of consumption and seeking gratification through objects as opposed to through inner satisfaction, I think is an important thing to explore.
I've been speaking with Richard Keiser, the CEO of Common Energy. You can learn more about their work by visiting their website, www.commonenergy.us. And be sure to check out more from the American Resilience Podcast by going to our website, www.amresproject.org. That's AMRES project.org. Please be sure to help us get noticed by liking us and leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, you can watch all of our films for free right there on our website. Be sure to sign up for our newsletter so we can send you updates on all of our upcoming films. And please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to support our ongoing work. Today's program was produced by American Resilience Project with editing help from Joseph Skinner and music by the great John Caban. Special thanks to Grace Dearden and Alexia Croft of Thomson Reuters for allowing us to record on location at their Responsible Business Conference. I'm Roger Sorkin. Thank you for listening, because civilization deserves a fighting chance.